So this is just a brief introduction to Green PB, or even just a brief history of PB. Obviously, people know myself, so I'm a director at Shared Future, and I've been working since 2000 to empower citizens by supporting new ways of doing PB. And I was very lucky in 2000 as a community activist to be asked to go on a learning exchange to Brazil, and that's where I got switched on to this. And obviously, Shared Future is the host organisation for this work, and our main work at the moment is around deliberative democracy. So that's citizens, juries, and assemblies, mostly but not exclusively on climate change. But we also do some social economy and enterprise projects, and we're working across the UK, although most of us are based in the northwest of England. So the origins of participatory budgeting is in Porto Alegre in Brazil. Many people will know that back in the 1980s, when there was a shift from the dictatorship to a democratic system, and PB was sort of invented then really as a way to manage the expectations that were arising and to try and structure the demands that communities had for investment after many years of austerity. Sounds slightly familiar, that whole word austerity now. Anyway, between 2000 and 2025, it's grown across the world, to very large scale processes in Paris or New York, to lots of micro processes, particularly in the UK. And the first PB grant making was actually £300,000, was around 2005 in Bradford in the UK. So the first wave of PB was under New Labour, and there was a national PB strategy between 2000 and 2010, where there was funding from the Department of Communities and Local Government to stimulate lots of PB pilots or experiences during that period of time. And there was a PB unit actually hosted by Church Action on Poverty, which was funded to offer that free support to local authorities and community organisations with pilots across England and Wales in particularly. And almost exclusively, they were what we would call small grants. So that was using funds from regeneration money, so additional to the sort of committed local authority budgets as such, generally in hyper-local places experiencing deprivation. So that was kind of what sometimes is called funny money. But with the austerity, with the global financial crash and then the Conservative governments, that momentum for PB drifted away. And by 2012, the PB unit was closing down, and there was a kind of decrease in the amount of PBs that were happening in particularly England and Wales. But there was then a second wave. So around that time, Shared Future, the host organisation, picked up that legacy from the PB unit and supported what was then the UK PB network. And we also started to connect with the Scottish government following the referendum in Scotland, the failed referendum for independence, where they wanted to develop a new Community Empowerment Act, and they picked up PB as a way of giving voice to citizens' demands in that sense. And so they funded the Community Choices programme, which initially ran from about 2014 through to about 2020. But the legacy of that work is still happening through the Scotland PB website, and also the development funding, considerable development funding that came from the Scottish government. And during that time, we also did work in Northern Ireland. So PB Works in Northern Ireland, as we tried to get the processes going there, and there are PB processes going there. And there's been a kind of continued evolution of PB in different environments across the UK. So we're moving perhaps into a third wave. Now, it has to be said that a lot of the policy interest now is in deliberative democracy. So those citizens' assemblies and juries, particularly following on from XR's third demand for citizens' assemblies. So there's lots of interest in deliberative democracy. But there's also all of that populism that we fear and hear about all the time, and that sort of right-wing narratives, and also all the post-Brexit cynicism. People are really fed up with government, and I think that gives us an opportunity to kickstart a new cycle of PB. And obviously, we've got the gathering climate emergency. And although there hasn't been any kind of national, and by national I mean UK-wide or even England, particularly funding for PB, that is still happening. And for example, places like Newham have got considerable funds that they distribute each year through PB. But what we've been basically seen is a shift towards more thematic PB. So that's youth, it might be Green PB. So rather than it just being place-based, it's about saying what are the particular needs we need to tackle and how does PB address those needs. I'm going to skip over that. So here was the initial definition of PB that was made by the by the Department of Communities when the first PB wave happened. So participatory budgeting is the process of directly involving local people in making decisions on the priorities and spending for a defined amount of public budget. And that definition actually went on for another couple of paragraphs or so. So very technical, very top-down, very boring language, but we've always stressed this quote, or I have, that I felt really sums up what PB is about, which is if it feels like we've decided it's PB and if it feels like someone else has decided it isn't. So it's that sense of agency that citizens get from doing something, getting involved in PB, and then seeing a change that happens from that, which is very different to our rather kind of blocked and over-centralized politics, in my view. So a few years ago, one of the international experts on PB came up with 7 defining characteristics, which is perhaps more useful than a simple definition. So that was that it's about real money. So there is a budget that is declared at some point to be distributed by citizens. It's not a consultation. So to some degree, the voice of citizens is binding over what happens with that money. It's not just about asking for priorities, it's actually making decisions. Ideally, it should be co-designed with citizens, so there's no one-size-fits-all model, and there should be a design process within PB that enables it to fit the local context. It's more than just voting. Voting is really important. It's the moment when people exercise their power, but there's a lot more to it than just the moment of voting for different projects in your community, particularly that it promotes equity. So that actually there should be built into its rules and into its kind of culture the idea that we are going to direct funds to where need is greatest. It should be open and accountable, so everyone should know, as we saw in the video, where the money's gone, but also it helps people think more deeply about how government works and where money is within the system. And ideally, it is repeated on a yearly or perhaps a biannual basis. And so through that repetition, people start to grow and experience grows. And again, another quote which I picked up a few years ago, it's not my own: the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its budget, in its vision, it's found in its budget. So it's when that moment of moving from talking to actually taking action, and when the money is applied, that you know where real power lies. This is a cycle of PB. We've used this in many of our bits of work. Some of you who have met with me or see my presentations will recognise this. This is actually taken from a commissioning cycle for the health service many years ago, but it talks about the different phases when you are going to commission a new piece of work or bring about a new budget expenditure line. So it starts with design, where you actually work out how you're going to do this, then informing and engaging, going out, talking to people with knowledge of the particular issue that you're trying to solve, connecting with people, drawing people into the conversation, a setting of priorities, so identifying where that need is and how equity can be advanced through this process, how everyone can benefit, to developing particular proposals and decision making and the delivery of those projects, and then to scrutinizing and monitoring them, and then finally learning from that process. And really all of those aspects are important, and where PB it's about saying, how do we get citizens involved in all stages of that cycle, not just at the moment of the vote or the decision making, but how do we get it built in at all points of that budget making process. So we talked about participatory grants, so local decisions through voting events, and mainstream PB. So that's a term which is bit vague, but it basically means shaping the services and investments that of local government that will be delivered by local government. By local government, I mean the police as well, and health and housing and all the different agencies that work in local communities. So we're not going to go into this at great depth. There's a grant pot. That's the normal way that people start PB. It's got a name like community chest, the big dish out you decide, so you don't call it PB. And bidders present proposals to residents who vote on which to support. And they might vote through ballots, or they might vote online, or they might vote through handsets, as in the picture here. And what we know is it is effective. It engages people. They like taking part. It kind of builds a sense of energy. It's a fun event, and it can help support and build local action. Very briefly, mention Scotland. That's the mainstream. That's moving towards that culture of embedding participation. So as I said, it started with the Community Empowerment Act in Scotland, 2015, went through to the landmark agreement between the Scottish Government and COSLA, 2017-18, where 1% of local government budgets would be subject to PB, and all 32 local authorities committed to that. And that builds up. 1% sounds small, but builds up to a large amount of money. And a couple of years ago, the Scottish Government announced that it had achieved that target of at least 1% of budgets could be defined as being decided directly by citizens. But they also do lots of work around developing the equalities framework. So they worked with Glasgow Disability Alliance to make sure everyone could get involved. They embedded the PB Charter, so they came up with principles for when PB is seen to be working effectively that people could challenge government upon. And in 2021, they refreshed the original Community Choices programme with new goals. So they've really moved forward, and that's led to some of the very large-scale Green PB activity that's happened or is happening in Scotland. In one of the presentations later this month, or early next month, we'll be hearing from the Just Transitions Fund in Scotland, which has got £1 million in this cycle. I just wanted to finish off with this brief story. I know time is pressing about Belo Horizonte in Brazil. There's a link which we'll pick up from the presentation. It's called The City That Ended Hunger. That was a PB and also deliberative project that happened many years ago in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, where people came together to re-engineer the local food economy, and they developed all sorts of new strategies, such as opening up space in the city centres for farmers' markets. They opened up access to healthy food in favelas around the city. They set up subsidised meal cafes, which everyone could go to throughout the city. And over a number of years, relatively small investment in a percentage of the city's budget, they've achieved lower levels of food poverty than in most North American cities at that same time. And it started from this principle that to search for the solutions to hunger means to act within the principle that the status of citizen surpasses that of a mere consumer. So that was the sort of underlying values that really drove forward that early Belo Horizonte PB process. And do read up, it's a nice story. So that's the end of my presentation. We're going to have just an open conversation for a few minutes about really what would it take to get more local authorities to use Green PB, and build on the thoughts that you had in your first breakout session.